What if the most honest thing someone ever told you was also the most disarming? And what if that truth didn't break you, but made you question who you were before you heard it? Jonathan Reed, billionaire and master of calculated control, never expected to be undone by silence. Not by scandal, not by betrayal, but by a woman, Clara Hayes, who didn't hide behind charm or ambition. Just honesty. No experience. No past. Just 7 simple words that made him realize everything he built was rooted in performance, while she lived in truth. Now, imagine it's you. You finally met someone who doesn't play games, who lays her heart bare in a whisper. Would you know how to receive that kind of vulnerability, or would you run afraid of not being enough? This isn't a story about innocence. It's about strength, the kind that comes from not needing to impress, only to be real. If you believe love doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, like share and subscribe to Shining Stories, because sometimes the quietest truths leave the loudest echoes. Now step into the silence and let the story begin. Jonathan Reed had the kind of life people envied from a distance. His name was printed on billboards across the Northeast, luxurious housing developments, high-end commercial spaces, waterfront properties with shimmering glass facades, all bearing his signature touch. He was the man behind it all, the one whose handshake closed million-dollar deals, the one whose vision shaped skylines. But at 48, Jonathan often found himself sitting alone in the great room of his New Hampshire estate, a mug of coffee cooling beside him, watching the early light stretch across the snow-covered trees. He would stare through the tall windows and wonder, sometimes out loud, is this it? He wasn't lonely, not in the traditional sense. There were people everywhere, staff, partners, acquaintances who called to ask for favors disguised as casual conversations. Women came and went, most of them elegant, articulate, ambitious, but they never stayed long, not because he pushed them away, but because he never fully let them in. His success had come at a price, one he had been willing to pay until recently, lately. The silence in his house had begun to feel heavier. It no longer felt like peace. It felt like absence. It was during the winter review meeting that the topic of the Haven Project first came up, a revitalization initiative in the old river town of Creston, aiming to turn abandoned mill lots into a thriving community hub, affordable housing, cultural centers, gardens. To most of the board, it sounded quaint, sentimental, unprofitable. But something about the pitch caught Jonathan's attention. Maybe it was the language, the part that read, "This isn't just about rebuilding, it's about remembering." A few days later, Jonathan drove up to Creston himself. He wasn't expected, but that was how he liked it. Snow had just begun to fall when he pulled up to the modest municipal building where the planning team worked. He entered with the quiet command of someone used to being noticed without trying. Inside, a woman stood at a long table strewn with maps, paint samples, hand-drawn sketches. She had shoulder-length brown hair, clipped back loosely, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Her clothes were simple but well-worn, with flecks of sawdust still clinging to the sleeves. She looked up as he entered, unfazed. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said, offering a handshake without hesitation. "Clara Hayes, lead architect for the Haven Project." Her voice was warm, measured, steady. Jonathan paused. She wasn't what he expected. There were no layers of formality, no nervous glances, just a quiet confidence that seemed to stretch beyond the walls of that old building. He nodded. "I heard your project proposal." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And it's different." A small smile played at her lips. "Good different or risky different?" Jonathan didn't answer. He was still trying to figure that out. She gestured toward the sketches. "We're not looking to build something that shines. We're looking to build something that lasts." He stepped closer, scanning the designs. They weren't flashy. They had warmth, texture, almost memory. Clara watched him. Most developers come in wanting to replace what was lost. We want to integrate it. Let the past be part of the structure. Jonathan stayed a moment longer than he meant to. The sketches, the scent of wood shavings, the way the snow outside muted the world. It was all strangely grounding. Why this town, he asked. She met his gaze. Because towns like this raised people like me, and people like me don't often get asked to design anything, let alone reimagine home. For a moment, Jonathan didn't know what to say, not because he disagreed, but because he understood more than he cared to admit. He left that day with a copy of the proposal and Clara's business card tucked in his coat pocket. That night, back in his estate, Jonathan didn't turn on the news, didn't pour himself a drink. Instead, he sat by the fireplace, unfolded Clara's sketches, and looked at them under the amber light of his reading lamp. There was one drawing in particular, just pencil on textured paper. It showed a community garden surrounded by single-story homes with open porches and string lights, children drawn in soft, fleeting outlines, chasing each other. In one corner, a small note scribbled in cursive, designed to remember what safety feels like. Jonathan read it twice, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the man who had it all. He felt like the man who had missed something important. The following week, Jonathan found himself back in Creston, not with an entourage or a plan, but alone, driving a weathered Jeep instead of his usual black Range Rover. The roads were lined with pine trees dusted in snow, and the town moved at a pace that defied urgency. He didn't have an appointment. He wasn't even sure why he was there again. When he walked into the planning office, Clara was alone, crouched on the floor with rolls of tracing paper around her, sketching something by hand. She looked up, surprised, but not startled. "I thought millionaires sent emails," she teased gently. Jonathan cracked a smile. "They do. I just don't like waiting for replies." She motioned for him to sit. No fuss, no small talk. He lowered himself onto an old wooden chair as she spread out the sketch. "This is the south end of the lot. There used to be a textile mill here. We're thinking of converting it into a shared art space, something people can use freely. But I want to keep part of the original wall. The bricks have this reddish soot. It's ugly, but honest." Jonathan leaned in. The drawing was loose, impressionistic, yet there was something deeply intentional in every line. "You sketch everything by hand?" he asked. "When I can. It's slower, but it makes me think about why I'm drawing, not just what." He looked around the room. None of it was polished. Papers curled at the edges. The heater clicked noisily in the corner, and her coffee cup was stained and chipped. Yet for reasons he couldn't name, it felt more grounded than any penthouse he'd ever walked into. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to a small symbol near the corner of the drawing. "A wind chime," Clara replied. "It's based on the ones my grandmother used to hang on our porch. They're not part of the structure, but they change the way a place feels." He nodded slowly. "I've never thought of architecture that way," he admitted. Clara shrugged. "Most people don't. But spaces have memory. They hold breath. They echo silence. They protect. Or they wound. I designed to soften the sharp corners." That night, Jonathan sat in his study at home, the wood crackling in the fireplace again. He unrolled Clara's sketch, now slightly creased from the drive. He ran his fingers along the edges, stopping at the spot where she had drawn the chime. He found himself imagining the sound of it in the summer breeze. He also imagined her, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled, drawing with that still focus she carried like a second skin. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan made more trips to Creston, sometimes for business, sometimes just because. Clara never asked why. She simply made room at her work table, handed him coffee without sugar, and carried on. He began to notice things, the way she traced lines with the side of her pencil before committing to ink, the way she paused before answering questions, not to impress, but to listen to herself first, the way she didn't flinch when he disagreed, but instead invited him to explain more. One afternoon, as they walked the snowy trail behind the mill site, she asked without turning to him, "Why do you really care about this project?" Jonathan hesitated, then answered honestly, "I don't know. Maybe because I've built a lot of things that made money, none that made a difference." Clara stopped, looked at him. "You're allowed to change that. Just like that. No judgment, no sentimentality, just an open door." It was unsettling. The way she made him feel seen, not as a CEO or a public figure, but as a man who might still be in the middle of becoming Later, back at her studio, Clara showed him a personal project, a charcoal rendering of her childhood home, a one-story frame house with missing shingles, a sagging porch, but wildflowers blooming defiantly at the edge of the lot. "I draw it when I feel lost," she said. Jonathan asked softly, "Did you feel safe there?" She smiled faintly. "Not always, but it taught me what it means to want safety for others." He nodded, unsure what to say. Then, without thinking, he whispered, "You have this way of drawing what people need, not just what they ask for." Clara looked at him longer than usual. "Maybe because I've lived without it," she said, "and I think you have too." The room fell quiet. There was no music, no romantic lighting, just two people sitting in the presence of something neither could quite name yet. A pause between breaths, a sketch still in progress. The February snow was still thick on the ground when Jonathan invited Clara to walk through the north sector of the Haven site. It was a crisp afternoon, the kind where the sun touches everything in gold but gives away no warmth. They stepped through muddy paths, their boots crunching against gravel and frozen leaves. Clara carried a roll of blueprints under her arm, while Jonathan carried 2 steaming cups of cider. He handed her one without a word. She accepted it with a nod. No pleasantries. They didn't need them anymore. As they stood in front of the skeletal frame of what would become a community library, Clara said quietly, "This is my favorite part." Jonathan glanced at the unfinished wall, curious. "Why?" She stepped closer, pointing to the open window frames, still without glass. "Because it hasn't decided what kind of light it will let in yet," she said. "And sometimes we're like that too." Jonathan didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. That night, back in his home, he stood in his kitchen longer than necessary. He looked at the clean countertops, the expensive appliances that rarely saw use, the silence that wrapped around everything like insulation. And he thought of Clara's window. Over the next few weeks, their conversations began to stretch beyond concrete and code. Sometimes, she would share pieces of her past, a childhood spent between her grandmother's porch and her father's long absences. She talked about learning to build things because no one ever built anything for her, about how drawing was a way to find stability in chaos. Jonathan listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, he surprised himself. He told her about his father, a man who believed success was the only form of safety, about the pressure to achieve, to own, to never need anyone, about how, for most of his life, love felt like a liability. One late afternoon, Clara brought an old book to the site and handed it to him, Architecture of the Everyday. She smiled softly. Not everything beautiful needs to be monumental. He ran his fingers along the worn spine of the book. "Is this your way of saying I overbuild things?" She shrugged. "Sometimes, when we don't know how to live with silence, we cover it with stone." Jonathan laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. That laugh would become more frequent in the days ahead. In early March, during a planning meeting, Jonathan noticed the way Clara furrowed her brow when defending an idea, the way she tapped her pencil rhythmically against her notepad when thinking. He caught himself watching her longer than was necessary. She must have noticed. After the meeting, as they walked toward the parking lot, she said, "You've started showing up more." Jonathan nodded. "I've noticed." She smiled, but didn't press. That evening, she invited him to see the old warehouse she was slowly converting into her personal studio. It was just outside Creston, nestled near a disused railway line. The building was rough brick walls chipped by time, wooden beams exposed, but it breathed a kind of quiet resilience. Jonathan ran a hand along one of the walls. "You're really going to turn this into something?" Clara looked around, eyes soft. "I already have. Just not finished drawing it yet." Inside, an old drafting table sat near a tall window. Papers were pinned on the wall, some architectural, some abstract, some just scribbles that seemed to mean something only to her. One sketch caught Jonathan's eye, a tiny house on a hill, with a winding path and a tree at the back, leaning just slightly left. "This isn't part of the project," he said. "No," she replied. "That's just where I go when I need quiet." It's a house I've only ever built in my head. He looked at her, not at the sketch. Do you let anyone in there? Clara was quiet for a beat. Not often. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was spacious. Before leaving, Jonathan walked to the door, then turned back. I like the way you see things, he said. She tilted her head. Even when it complicates yours. He smiled, especially then. As he stepped outside, a gust of wind caught the edge of one of her pinned sketches. It fluttered slightly, like it was breathing. Maybe, Jonathan thought, buildings weren't the only things that could be rebuilt. Maybe people could too. Spring arrived slowly in Creston. The snow retreated like a quiet guest taking its leave, leaving behind soft patches of green and the smell of damp earth. Everything was waking up. Trees, sidewalks, people. Jonathan found himself returning to town more frequently. The visits were never planned long in advance. Sometimes he brought a new proposal for the Haven project. Sometimes he didn't bring anything at all, Clara noticed, but she never asked why. One afternoon, she found him in the corner of her studio, flipping through a pile of old architectural books. He looked up, a little embarrassed, caught in the act of curiosity. You're becoming a regular, she said, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. Jonathan smiled. You make silence feel less lonely. She handed him a mug. That's probably the nicest thing anyone said to me all year. They sat in her studio as the rain began to fall outside, tapping softly against the window pane. It was the kind of rain that made the world feel smaller and safer. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The kind of silence where something invisible gets built between people. Jonathan broke it first. Do you ever think about getting away? He asked. Clara looked at him, thoughtful. Not in the way most people do. I don't crave beaches or resorts. I crave stillness. He nodded. I have a house up north, in Vermont. It's barely used. Just wood and quiet. She raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. In what way? She smiled, in the way that I might not want to come back. He hesitated, then said, Come with me. Just for a few days. No agenda. No blueprints. Clara paused. She wasn't someone who said yes easily, but something in his eyes wasn't asking for a favor. It was asking for presence. All right, she said, but I'm bringing my sketchbook. The drive to Vermont took nearly 4 hours. They didn't fill it with much talking. Some music, some silence, a few observations about the landscape rolling past the windows. The house sat at the edge of a pine forest, with wide windows facing a small frozen lake. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Wooden beams, stone fireplace, no distractions. The first night, they cooked together. Clara found an old cast-iron skillet and made grilled cheese with herbs. Jonathan chopped vegetables clumsily, earning a raised eyebrow and a smirk. You run a real estate empire but can't slice a tomato, I delegate, he said, grinning. They ate on the floor, picnic style, using a folded blanket as a tablecloth. No candles, no wine glasses, just food and quiet laughter. Later, Clara put on an old vinyl she found in the cabinet, soft jazz that crackled like memory. I didn't peg you as a jazz person, Jonathan said. I'm not, she replied. But it sounds like something people listen to when they're learning how to trust. He didn't answer, just watched her from across the room as she sat by the fire, legs tucked beneath her, flipping through her sketchbook. On the second night, they sat side by side on the porch, wrapped in separate blankets, watching the moon reflect off the lake. Clara spoke softly. I don't really know what this is between us. I just know it doesn't feel performative. Jonathan turned his head. Performative. She looked at him. Most people only show the parts of themselves that they think are acceptable. With you, I don't feel like I have to explain myself. That's rare. He nodded slowly. It is. They didn't touch. Not yet. But something passed between them in that pause, a thread of trust that hadn't been there before. That night, Clara placed her sketchbook on the table between them and opened to a new page. It was a drawing of the house, not exact, not detailed, but full of softness, warm light through windows. A porch that seemed to invite you to stay a little longer. She turned it toward him. You brought me here, she said, but I think I might be drawing it into my own story now. Jonathan looked at the sketch, then at her, his voice low. I didn't know I needed someone until I met someone who didn't need me. Clara closed the book. There was nothing romantic in the moment, and yet it was the most intimate one they had shared. A love had begun to write itself without scripts, without declarations, just gestures, just presence. A love made not of fireworks, but of firewood and quiet space. By the third evening in Vermont, the house had started to feel lived in. The fireplace burned more confidently. Mugs from the morning lingered on the counter, their coffee stains catching afternoon light. A stack of folded blankets waited beside the couch, and Clara's sketchbook now rested on the windowsill like it belonged there. Jonathan stood at the stove, watching soup simmer. Clara, wrapped in an old sweater she'd found in the guest closet, was setting the table 2 plates, no napkins, mismatched silverware. It was quiet, a kind of quiet that didn't ask to be filled. Later, after dinner, they found themselves on the floor again, backs against the couch, legs stretched out toward the fireplace. Clara leaned her head back, eyes closed. Do you ever think about how strange it is, she murmured, that 2 people can live entire lives before they ever truly meet anyone? Jonathan turned to her. You mean romantically? No. I mean, being seen. Really seen. No performance, no role, just you. He thought for a moment. I don't think I've let anyone do that. Not all the way. She nodded. Me neither. Silence. Then, without looking at him, she said it, plain, almost too soft for the fire to compete. I've never been with anyone before. Jonathan blinked, unsure if he heard her correctly. She didn't clarify. She didn't look embarrassed or uncertain, just present. He turned his eyes toward the fire, not because he was shocked, but because he didn't want to meet her gaze with any reaction she might read as judgment. After a moment, he asked, Not ever. She shook her head once. No. Another pause. It's not because I think it's wrong, she said, or because I was saving it. I just never felt safe enough. Not physically, not emotionally. And then I got older, and the world kept assuming I had, so I let them. It was easier. Jonathan didn't rush to respond. He stared into the flames like they might hand him the right words. He knew the man he had been 10 years ago would have said something clever, something dismissive, or even reassuring but rehearsed. But the man sitting on that floor had changed. So he leaned closer, just slightly, not touching her, not even looking directly at her, and said, Thank you for trusting me with that. Clara looked at him now, surprised. Her shoulders dropped. Just a little. You don't think I'm broken? Jonathan let out a quiet breath. Clara, I've been with people who have decades of experience and not a shred of presence. You're the most whole person I've ever met. A quiet fell between them, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was full. That night, they didn't sleep together, not in the way most people mean, but they did fall asleep on the same couch, under the same blanket, with her head resting lightly on his shoulder, and his arm around her, not claiming, not assuming, just being. When Jonathan woke up in the dim light of early morning, Clara was already awake, sitting by the window with tea in her hands, sketching the sunrise. He walked over and stood behind her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. You okay? He asked. She nodded. Better than I thought I would be. Why? She turned the sketchbook toward him. It was a drawing of the 2 of them from the night before, simple lines, not detailed, but unmistakably them, sharing silence, sharing space. Because for the first time, she said, I shared something, and the world didn't fall apart. Jonathan didn't say anything. Instead, he kissed the top of her head, soft, unrushed. And in that moment, he knew this woman, this house, this stillness, none of it was planned. But maybe that's what made it real. The cabin was still warm from the night fire. Morning light trickled through the tall windows, catching specks of dust that danced like quiet confessions in the air. Jonathan stood at the sink, washing their breakfast plates by hand. Clara had stepped outside with her sketchbook, saying she wanted to capture the light before it shifted. The door had clicked shut behind her, leaving Jonathan alone with the hum of the kettle and the rustle of tall pines beyond the glass. But it wasn't the silence of the cabin that pressed against him. It was the silence inside. Her words from the night before hadn't left him, not even for a moment. "I've never been with anyone." He had accepted it, gently, sincerely. He had done what he knew was right, held space, offered trust, withheld judgment. But now, in the quiet, something stirred, not judgment, not even confusion. Fear, not of her, but of himself. What if I break this? What if I am not capable of loving someone so whole in her vulnerability? Jonathan had spent a lifetime building walls that looked like ambition. He had mastered the art of appearing available while remaining emotionally unreachable. People respected him, envied him, even admired him. But no one had ever been brave enough to hand him their unguarded self, not like Clara had. And he wasn't sure if he was man enough, not the kind who makes deals, but the kind who holds another human being with reverence instead of control. He dried his hands slowly, staring at his own reflection in the kitchen window. The man looking back at him wore a flannel shirt, soft at the collar, sleeves rolled, a little older than he remembered, but behind the eyes, the same question lingered. Who are you when no one needs you to be strong? Clara returned not long after, cheeks pink from the cold, a small smile on her lips. You look like you just fought a bear in there, she teased, setting her sketchbook on the table. Jonathan gave a half smile, but didn't respond. She paused, studied his face. Her voice softened. You're thinking too loud. He sat down across from her, hands folded, uncertain. I'm afraid I'll mess this up, he said. Clara didn't flinch. What part of it? He hesitated. You trusted me with something rare, and I don't want to handle it like I've handled everything else in my life, transactional, impatient, neat. She looked at him for a long moment, then reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Jonathan, she said gently, I didn't tell you that so you could protect me. I told you because I didn't want to keep hiding, from you or from myself. He swallowed hard. I don't know how to love someone without performing. Then let's not perform, she said simply. Let's just stay. See what happens. There was something so profoundly disarming in the way she said it. No expectations, no ultimatums, just presence. He nodded slowly. I want to learn, he said. The rest of the day passed quietly. They read, cooked, walked the trail behind the house. Clara didn't push for conversation. She gave him space without making him feel alone. That night, as they sat by the fire again, Clara spoke softly. When I was 12, I used to sit on the roof of my grandmother's trailer and count the stars, wondering which one was holding the version of me that didn't feel so broken. Jonathan turned toward her. You don't seem broken to me. She smiled faintly. That's because you see me now, but you didn't see the years it took to get here. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice low. Then I'm honored to know the you that survived. She looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes shimmered with something close to tears. I'm not asking you to heal me, she whispered. Just don't disappear. He reached for her hand, not quickly, not dramatically, just steady. I won't, he said. And this time, he meant it. The following morning began like the others, quiet, still, with the faint smell of pine and roasted coffee lingering in the cabin. Clara was on the porch, sketching the tree line, wrapped in a wool blanket. Jonathan was inside, restocking the firewood from the pile beside the door. It should have been an ordinary day. But silence, when unspoken thoughts linger too long, becomes sharp. It began with something small, Jonathan asking if Clara had thought about where this relationship might go, whether she ever pictured a more permanent kind of future. She didn't answer right away. She folded her sketchbook closed and looked out toward the trees. Why do we need to define it? She asked gently. Because if we don't, he replied, it starts to feel like we're avoiding something. Clara turned to him, eyes calm but firm. I'm not avoiding anything. I just don't want to turn this into a checklist. A house, a title, a timeline. I spent years trying to be who people expected. I won't do it again, not even for you. Jonathan was quiet, but inside, the familiar tension returned that pull between what he knew and what he was now trying to learn. He took a breath. I'm not asking you to fit into a mold. I'm just trying to understand what we're building. Clara stood up, folding the blanket over the railing. Maybe we don't need to build anything yet, she said. Maybe we just need to be... He looked at her, voice low. That works for people who've always had the freedom to just be. She blinked. And you haven't, Jonathan hesitated. No. Everything I've ever had came with expectations, results, control. Clara crossed her arms, but her voice remained steady. I'm not one of your developments, Jonathan. I don't come with permits and renderings. He winced, not at her tone, but at the truth of it. That's not what I meant. Isn't it, she said, because every time I speak from instinct, you try to organize it, name it, build walls around it. There it was, not an explosion, but a quiet shattering. She wasn't angry, she was hurt. And Jonathan felt it in his chest like a door swinging open in the middle of winter. I don't know how to love freely, he said finally. I only know how to hold on tightly enough that it doesn't fall apart. Clara stepped closer. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe love isn't about holding tight. Maybe it's about trusting that it won't leave even when you let go. She left that afternoon not angrily, but with that same quietness that had once made Jonathan feel safe. Now, it felt like distance. She said she needed space, just a day or two, to return to Creston, to breathe, to think. Jonathan stayed. The cabin felt larger, emptier, her mug still on the counter, a sketch pinned to the fridge with a small magnet in the shape of a fox. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, pen in hand, staring at the blank page of a journal he hadn't touched in years. Then, slowly, he began to write, not business plans, not strategy notes, but a letter. Clara, I don't know how to be the man you need yet, but I want to learn, not to win you, but because being around you has made me want to become someone I can respect. You are not fragile. You are not waiting to be rescued. You are not broken. And I see that now more clearly than ever. But I am still learning how to show up without trying to fix everything. That's hard for me, because fixing has always felt safer than feeling. Still, I want to feel this. All of it. Even the parts that scare me. Come back when you're ready. Or don't. I'll still be better for having known you. Jay, he folded the letter, left it on the table, and finally, for the first time in years, he slept. Not easily, but honestly. 2 days later, Clara returned. She didn't knock, just walked in, windblown and quiet, and sat down beside him as he was reading by the fire. Neither of them spoke. She reached into her coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and set it on his lap. It was a sketch, 2 people sitting back to back on the floor, both facing opposite directions, a string connecting their hands, taut, but not breaking. On the corner, she had written, "Some threads hold, even when you don't pull." Jonathan looked at her. "I read your letter," she said. "I meant it." "I know," she replied. "That's why I came back." He touched her hand lightly, and this time, neither of them pulled away. A heavy storm rolled through Vermont that night. Rain slapped the windows like a heartbeat too strong to ignore. Wind howled through the trees, bending branches like whispered confessions in the dark. Inside the cabin, the fire was lit, but neither Jonathan nor Clara reached for warmth. They sat close, but not touching. The space between them wasn't distance anymore. It was reverence. Jonathan turned toward her, voice low. "Can I ask you something?" Clara met his gaze. "You can ask. I may or may not answer." He nodded. "Expected that. The first time you said you'd never been with anyone, I believed you. But I also knew there was more to it, something behind it. Was it fear?" Clara looked into the fire. The flames danced quietly, as if waiting too. Then, slowly, she began to speak. When I was 17, she said, I lived with my father in a trailer outside of Shasta County. My mother had passed the year before. My father, he wasn't cruel, but he wasn't well either. Jonathan listened, breath still. There was a man, a family friend, someone who helped fix cars and brought us food sometimes. He was kind, or so I thought. She paused, not to collect herself, but to find the right words. He never hurt me physically, but he made me feel watched, like my body was not mine. I started shrinking without realizing. I stopped wearing bright colors. I avoided mirrors. Her voice didn't break. It didn't need to. The thing is, nothing happened. Jonathan. Not in the way the world defines trauma. But it did happen, every time he got too close. Every time my father ignored the way I flinched. Every time silence won. Jonathan reached for her hand, carefully. She didn't pull away. I carried that silence into adulthood. She continued. Into college, into work, into every relationship I never let begin. Until one day, I just told myself, maybe love isn't for me. A tear slid down her cheek, and she wiped it quickly, almost automatically. I never told anyone that before. Jonathan's voice was rough with emotion. Clara, I don't have words that can fix what you've carried, but I see you now, all of you, and I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him, truly looked, and in that gaze was something deeper than relief. It was release. Later that night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Clara fell asleep with her head on Jonathan's chest. He held her like someone cradles a truth too sacred to drop. But he couldn't sleep. His own memories had been stirred. In the quiet dark, Jonathan whispered more to the room than to her. When I was 10, my mother left, no warning, just a note on the table and an empty closet. Clara shifted slightly, still asleep. My father never spoke of it. He just worked, bought silence with success. I watched him become everything I later admired and everything I swore I'd never be. And yet, I followed his blueprint anyway. He exhaled shakily. I learned to protect myself with distance because I thought, if people don't get close, they can't leave. In the morning, neither of them mentioned what had been said, not out of avoidance, but because some truths don't need to be revisited, they need to be honored. They made breakfast together quietly, eggs, toast, slices of apple. Clara hummed an old folk song under her breath. Jonathan watched her move, every gesture so rooted, so sure. After they ate, they took a walk through the wet woods. The storm had passed, leaving the world glistening and strangely clean. At the edge of the trail, Clara stopped and turned to him. You know, she said, the thing I feared most wasn't being touched. It was being misunderstood. Jonathan replied without hesitation. Then let me spend my life trying to understand. She smiled not brightly, but with depth, a smile not of certainty, but of peace. And for the first time, both of them understood that love wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing each other anyway. The first snow of December arrived like a whisper, soft, quiet, and utterly transformative. Creston was cloaked in white, the streets muted, rooftops brushed with frost, and the newly completed Haven project glowing under strings of warm light. It didn't just look finished, it felt lived in, even before anyone had moved in. The once abandoned lot now stood proud. Small homes built with reclaimed wood formed a crescent around a central community center. Wide sidewalks curved around garden beds, empty for now, but ready for spring. And in the center of it all was the heart of Clara's design. A winter garden. A square of raised beds, filled with evergreens, stone sculptures, and warm benches with wool throws. Wind chimes swayed gently from wooden beams. The garden wasn't meant to bloom, it was meant to endure. Jonathan stood beside her that morning, hands in the pockets of his wool coat, watching people begin to gather for the soft opening. You really made this happen, he said quietly. Clara glanced at him. No, we did. You gave the space. I gave it shape. He nodded. It was true and deeper than architecture. Their love had become this project's foundation, not a loud romance, but a steady commitment to show up, to listen, to build with presence instead of pride. As guests began to fill the central courtyard, Jonathan stepped back, letting Clara take the spotlight. She hated microphones, but she didn't shy away. Standing at the front steps of the community hall, she addressed the crowd. This place was never meant to impress. She began. It was meant to belong, to those who felt forgotten, to stories never written, to families who deserved more than just shelter. She paused, eyes scanning the faces of elders, single parents, children bundled in oversized coats. I've always believed architecture isn't about structure, it's about emotion, memory, identity. And this project, this is a thank you to every person who dared to ask for more, even when no one was listening. The courtyard was silent, full, but hushed. And if you ever wonder what hope looks like in the middle of winter, walk through the garden, sit on the bench, listen to the wind. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. But Jonathan, standing at the back with his coat collar turned up against the cold, felt his throat tighten. He had been to 1,000 ribbon cuttings. This one felt like a benediction. Later that afternoon, after the crowd had left and snow began falling again, Clara and Jonathan walked alone through the central path. She stopped in front of a wooden sign at the edge of the garden. It read, "Built for those who had nowhere to begin." Jonathan looked at it, then at her. "You chose those words." She nodded, "Because they were once mine." He touched the edge of the sign gently, as if it might vanish. "I would have never known how much I didn't understand, if I hadn't met you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You didn't try to understand. You became part of it. That's what matters." They sat together on one of the benches, snow gathering in quiet flakes on their coats. Clara pulled something from her coat pocket, a small envelope. "I was going to wait," she said, "but I think now is right." Inside the envelope was a folded letterhead, an official certificate from the state, confirming the approval of the Hayes Reed Foundation. Jonathan blinked. "What is this, a non-profit, funded from the project's surplus and some of your silent donations?" she said with a smile. "Scholarships, creative grants, mentorship for young architects who come from where I came from." He looked at her in awe. "You did this?" She nodded. "We did this." Jonathan couldn't find the words, so instead, he kissed her temple. A kiss without fanfare, without expectation, just truth. The snow kept falling, but in the garden, surrounded by evergreens and quiet benches, something sacred had already taken root. Not just shelter, not just healing, legacy. Winter in Creston faded slowly. Snow turned to slush, then to wet soil, and finally into a soft green hush. The Haven project was now fully lived in. Clotheslines fluttered in backyards. Children's chalk drawings bloomed on sidewalks. Inside the community kitchen, people shared meals, stories, and sometimes long silences that felt like belonging. Jonathan and Clara had moved into one of the houses near the garden, not the largest one, not the most private, but the one with the eastern windows that caught the morning sun. They didn't marry. They didn't need to. There were no grand declarations, no Facebook posts, no rings exchanged under archways of roses. But every morning, Jonathan rose before her to make coffee, and every evening, Clara sketched by the window until her eyes got heavy. They chose each other in the smallest of ways, again and again. One afternoon, Clara found Jonathan standing in the backyard, building a wooden bench from scratch. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his hands dusty with sawdust. He looked up, smiling the way a man does when he's doing something not for perfection, but for purpose. She brought him lemonade and sat on the grass, barefoot, watching him work. "You know," she said, "you've changed." He nodded, still focused on sanding the wood. "I know. Do you miss the old life?" He paused. "No," he said simply. "It wasn't a life. It was a performance." She smiled. "You were a convincing actor. Too good," he admitted. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt like music if you listened closely enough. Then Clara said softly, "I found an old voicemail from my grandmother this morning. I didn't even know I had it saved. Jonathan looked over. She said, "The people who stay are the ones who don't need to prove they love you every day, they just do." He put down the sander, walked over, and kissed her forehead. "No need to say it," she added. "I wasn't going to," he replied. She laughed quietly. "Good. Because we already live like we mean it." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, they sat on the bench he had just finished, watching the garden glow under the early spring light. A little girl from one of the nearby homes ran by with a notebook in hand, barefoot and beaming. "Hi, Miss Clara," she called out. Clara waved. "What are you drawing today?" "A house." But this time with a garden inside it. Clara's eyes sparkled. "That's the best kind." Jonathan watched her, chest full with something that didn't need naming. He had once built towers that reached for the sky, hoping one might finally make him feel tall enough to matter. But this was where he truly stood, tallest. Years would pass. There would be more projects, more seasons. 1,000 ordinary days folded into each other like the lines of Clara's quiet sketches. But they would always come home to each other. Not because they promised to, but because they wanted to. And one day, decades later, a young architecture student would walk through the garden and stop to read the small plaque beneath the bench. It would read, "In honor of two people who never stopped choosing each other." And beneath it, carved gently into the wood, 4 simple words: truth, shelter, love, stay. What if love didn't ask for perfection, but simply presents Jonathan and Clara's story, reminds us that the most sacred relationships aren't built on grand gestures or flawless pasts. They're built on the courage to stay, especially when truth enters the room uninvited. But in a world still quick to judge what it doesn't understand, where a woman's worth is questioned for her past, and a man's value tied to what he owns, not how he feels, we must ask, when did love become a privilege? Instead of a right to be human together, discrimination doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, "She's too complicated. He's too soft. They don't belong." But here's the truth. Everyone belongs in a love that sees them whole. If this story moved something in you, a memory, a wish, a wound, know this, you're not alone. And the kind of love that chooses understanding over expectation, it still exists. Like this video, if it stirred something in your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear they are enough. And subscribe to Shining Stories to walk with us through more tales that heal, confront, and connect. Because the next story we tell might just be yours.